The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The mechanic was in his small workshop, tinkering with an old engine, when the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something else. A loud, thunderous crash echoed through the valley, followed by a blinding flash of light that lit up the sky. He dropped his tools and ran outside. In the distance, beyond the trees, a column of smoke rose into the air. His heart raced. He grabbed a flashlight and hurried toward the source, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. The closer he got, the stranger things became. The air smelled metallic, like burnt wires and something he couldn't quite place. When he finally reached the crash site, his breath caught in his throat. A massive, sleek object, definitely not from Earth, was half buried in the ground. It was glowing faintly, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The mechanic hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. The ship's door was partially open, and a faint, eerie light spilled out. He could hear a low hum, like the sound of a dying machine. Swallowing his fear, he climbed inside. The interior was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The walls were smooth and metallic, with glowing panels and strange devices he couldn't begin to understand. And then he saw her. She was slumped against the wall, her skin a pale, shimmering blue. Her eyes were closed, and she was breathing heavily. She looked humanoid but undeniably alien, with long, delicate fingers and hair that seemed to float around her head like it was underwater. Her clothes were torn, and she had a deep wound on her side, oozing a strange, glowing liquid. The mechanic froze, unsure of what to do. But then her eyes fluttered open, and she looked straight at him. Her eyes were a deep, mesmerizing violet, filled with pain and desperation. She reached out a trembling hand and spoke, her voice soft but urgent. "Help me," she said, her words translated by a small device on her wrist. "Please." The mechanic hesitated. He was just a simple man, a fixer of cars and machines. This was beyond anything he'd ever dealt with. But the look in her eyes, pleading, vulnerable, touched something deep inside him. He couldn't just walk away. "Okay," he said, his voice shaky. "I'll help you." She managed a weak smile, and he felt a strange sense of purpose wash over him. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but he knew one thing: his life was about to change forever. The mechanic worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision. The alien woman, her name, she said, was something he couldn't pronounce, so he called her Luma, watched him from a corner of the ship, her violet eyes filled with curiosity and gratitude. The ship was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The technology was advanced, far beyond human understanding, but the mechanic had a gift. He could look at a machine, no matter how complicated, and figure out how it worked. It was like the pieces spoke to him, telling him what needed to be done. "This is incredible," he muttered, examining a damaged panel. "The way these circuits are designed, it's like nothing on Earth." Luma smiled weakly. "Your people are not so primitive as you think," she said. "You have a talent." The mechanic shrugged. "I just fix things. It's what I do." As he worked, Luma told him more about her mission. She was from a distant planet, one that was dying. Her ship carried a device that could save her people, but it had been damaged during the crash. If she didn't repair it soon, her planet would be lost. The mechanic listened, his heart heavy. He couldn't imagine the weight of such a responsibility. But he also felt a spark of determination. If he could help her, he would. Hours passed, and the ship began to come back to life. The mechanic replaced damaged parts with makeshift solutions, using materials from his workshop. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to get the ship running again. Luma watched him with growing admiration. "You are remarkable," she said. "Your skills are rare, even among my people." The mechanic smiled, a little embarrassed. "I'm just doing what I can." But as the ship's systems powered up, a warning light flashed on the control panel. Luma's expression turned grim. "They're coming," she said. "Who's coming?" the mechanic asked, though he already had a bad feeling. "The ones who chased me here," Luma replied. "They want the device. They will stop at nothing to get it." The mechanic's heart raced. He wasn't a fighter. He was just a mechanic. But he couldn't leave Luma to face this alone. "What do we do?" he asked. Luma looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We fight." The mechanic's hands trembled as he tightened the last bolt on the ship's damaged panel. The warning light on the control console blinked faster now, a relentless reminder that danger was approaching. Luma stood beside him, her face pale but determined. "How much time do we have?" the mechanic asked, his voice tight with worry. Luma glanced at the console. "Not much. They will be here soon." The mechanic wiped the sweat from his brow and looked around the ship. It was in better shape now, but it still wasn't ready to fly. They needed more time they didn't have. "We can't fight them head-on," he said. "We're outnumbered and outgunned." Luma nodded. "We don't need to defeat them. We just need to hold them off long enough to finish the repairs." The mechanic took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't a soldier. He'd never been in a fight in his life. But he couldn't let Luma down. "Not now." "All right," he said. "What's the plan?" Luma led him to a storage compartment and opened it, revealing an array of strange devices. She handed him one, a small, handheld tool that looked like a cross between a flashlight and a gun. "This is a stun device," she explained. "It won't kill, but it will incapacitate them for a while." The mechanic turned the device over in his hands, feeling its weight. It was lighter than he expected, but it hummed with a faint energy that made his skin tingle. "What about you?" he asked. Luma picked up another device, this one larger and more complex. "I'll handle the ship's defenses. But I need you to protect the perimeter." "Can you do that?" The mechanic hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do my best." They moved quickly, setting up makeshift barricades around the ship. The mechanic positioned himself near the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest around them was eerily quiet, as if the animals sensed the coming danger. Then he heard it, a low, mechanical hum, growing louder by the second. He peered into the darkness and saw them, 3 sleek, black ships descending from the sky. They landed a short distance away, and figures began to emerge, tall, armored beings with glowing red eyes. The mechanic's grip tightened on the stun device. He crouched behind a fallen tree, trying to stay hidden. His mind raced, searching for a way to outsmart them. The pursuers moved with precision, scanning the area with their weapons raised. One of them spotted the mechanic's workshop and gestured to the others. They began to move toward it. The mechanic's heart sank. If they searched the workshop, they'd find tools and materials that could lead them to the ship. He had to act fast. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out from behind the tree and fired the stun device. A bright beam of light shot out, hitting one of the pursuers square in the chest. The figure crumpled to the ground, stunned. The other pursuers turned toward him, their weapons glowing ominously. The mechanic ducked behind the tree just as a blast of energy slammed into it, sending splinters flying. "Luma, now would be a good time for those defenses," he shouted. Inside the ship, Luma activated the ship's systems. A force field shimmered into existence around the ship, deflecting the pursuers' attacks. The mechanic used the distraction to fire again, taking down another pursuer. But there were too many of them. The mechanic's stun device was running out of power, and the pursuers were closing in. He glanced back at the ship, hoping Luma had a plan. Just as the pursuers reached the edge of the force field, the ship's engines roared to life. A powerful shockwave erupted from the ship, knocking the pursuers off their feet. The mechanic was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. When he looked up, the pursuers were retreating, dragging their stunned comrades with them. The mechanic let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with adrenaline. Luma appeared at the ship's entrance, her face filled with relief. "You did it," she said. The mechanic managed a weak smile. "We did it." But as he looked at the damaged ship and the retreating pursuers, he knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge was still ahead. The mechanic sat on the floor of the ship, his back against the wall, trying to catch his breath. His hands were still shaking, and his clothes were damp with sweat. The battle with the pursuers had left him exhausted, but alive. For now, that was enough. Luma approached him, holding a small device that emitted a soft, healing light. She knelt beside him and gently pressed it against a cut on his arm. The mechanic winced at first, but the pain quickly faded, replaced by a soothing warmth. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "For everything." Luma smiled softly. "You are the one who saved us. I should be thanking you." The mechanic shook his head. "I just did what I had to do. I'm not a hero." "You are to me," Luma said, her violet eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Luma stood and offered him her hand. "Come," she said. "Let's get you something to eat." The mechanic took her hand and let her help him to his feet. They moved to a small area of the ship that served as a living space. Luma handed him a strange, glowing fruit. It looked unlike anything he'd ever seen, but he was too hungry to care. He took a bite, surprised by its sweet, tangy flavor. As they ate, Luma began to tell him more about her world. She spoke of vast, shimmering cities and oceans that glowed under twin moons. But she also spoke of war and loss, of a planet on the brink of destruction. "Our leaders made a mistake," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "They tried to control a power they didn't understand. Now, our world is dying. That's why I must return with the device. It's our only hope." The mechanic listened, his heart aching for her. He couldn't imagine the weight of such a responsibility. But he also admired her courage. "You're brave," he said. "Braver than I could ever be." Luma shook her head. "Bravery is not the absence of fear. It's doing what must be done, even when you are afraid. You showed that today." The mechanic looked down, feeling a lump in his throat. He wasn't used to being praised. For most of his life, he'd been invisible, just a simple mechanic in a small town. But Luma saw something in him that he didn't see in himself. "What about you?" Luma asked. "What is your story?" The mechanic hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself. But something about Luma made him want to open up. "There's not much to tell," he said. "I've always been good with machines. My dad taught me everything I know. But after he passed away, I guess I just lost my way. I've been alone for a long time." Luma reached out and placed her hand on his. "You're not alone anymore." The mechanic looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of connection, of belonging. As the hours passed, they continued to talk, sharing stories and laughter. The mechanic told her about his childhood, about the old cars he'd fixed and the dreams he'd once had. Luma listened intently, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. But as the night wore on, the mechanic couldn't shake the feeling that their time together was running out. The ship was almost repaired, and soon Luma would have to leave. The thought filled him with a strange sadness. "What will you do when you go back?" he asked. Luma's expression grew serious. "I will do what I must to save my people. But I will never forget you. You have given me hope, and for that, I am forever grateful." The mechanic nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to say more, to tell her how much she meant to him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply said, "I'll miss you." Luma smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I will miss you." The mechanic sat cross-legged on the floor of the ship, tinkering with a piece of machinery. The repairs were almost complete, and the ship hummed with renewed energy. Luma watched him work, her expression thoughtful. "You have a gift," she said, breaking the silence. "Your ability to understand machines is extraordinary." The mechanic shrugged, a little embarrassed. "It's just something I've always been good at. I don't think it's that special." Luma leaned closer, her violet eyes intense. "It is special. And it's not just about fixing things. You see possibilities where others see only problems. That's why I need to tell you something." The mechanic looked up, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" Luma hesitated, as if weighing her words. Then she took a deep breath and said, "The device I'm carrying, it's not just a tool to save my planet. It's a weapon." The mechanic's hands froze. "A weapon?" Luma nodded. "A powerful one. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy entire worlds. That's why the pursuers are after me. They want to use it for their own gain." The mechanic's mind raced. He had risked his life to help Luma, but he hadn't fully understood the stakes. Now, the weight of her mission felt overwhelming. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "I was afraid," Luma admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't help me if you knew the truth. But I trust you now. And I need your help more than ever." The mechanic stared at her, his emotions a tangled mix of anger, fear, and admiration. He wanted to be upset with her for keeping such a big secret, but he also understood why she had done it. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. Luma's expression softened with relief. "I need you to help me finish the repairs and get the ship off this planet. Once we're in space, I can activate the device and send it to my people. But we have to move quickly. The pursuers will return, and next time, they'll be prepared." The mechanic nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't fully understand the device or its power, but he trusted Luma. And he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't let the pursuers win. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." They spent the next few hours working side by side, their movements synchronized as if they'd been partners for years. The mechanic focused on the ship's engines, while Luma calibrated the device. The air was thick with tension, but also a sense of purpose. As they worked, the mechanic couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced out the ship's window, scanning the dark forest. At first, he saw nothing. But then, in the distance, he noticed a faint glow, a telltale sign of the pursuers' ships. "Luma," he said, his voice urgent. "They're back." Luma's eyes widened. She rushed to the control panel and activated the ship's scanners. The screen lit up, showing multiple ships approaching fast. "We're out of time," she said. "We have to leave now." The mechanic grabbed his tools and secured the last panel. "The engines are ready. Let's go." Luma nodded and took her place at the controls. The ship's engines roared to life, shaking the ground beneath them. The mechanic strapped himself into a seat, his heart pounding. As the ship lifted off, the pursuers opened fire. Blasts of energy streaked past the windows, narrowly missing them. Luma maneuvered the ship with skill, dodging the attacks and accelerating toward the sky. The mechanic clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He had never been in space before, and the experience was both thrilling and terrifying. But as the ship broke through the atmosphere and the stars came into view, he felt a strange sense of calm. They had made it. For now. But as the mechanic looked at Luma, he knew their journey was far from over. The device, the pursuers, the fate of Luma's planet, it was all part of something much bigger than he had imagined. And he was no longer just a mechanic. He was a part of this story, for better or worse. The ship soared through space, leaving Earth far behind. The mechanic stared out the window, mesmerized by the endless expanse of stars. It was beautiful, but also overwhelming. He had never imagined he'd see something like this. Luma worked at the control panel, her hands moving swiftly as she prepared to activate the device. The mechanic could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened with focus. "How long until we can send the device to your people?" he asked. "Not long," Luma replied. "But we're not safe yet. The pursuers are still following us." The mechanic glanced at the scanner screen. Sure enough, several blips were closing in. His stomach churned. They had escaped Earth, but the danger was far from over. "What happens if they catch us?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Luma's expression darkened. "They'll take the device and use it to destroy worlds. Billions of lives will be lost. We can't let that happen." The mechanic nodded, his resolve hardening. He had come this far. He couldn't back down now. Suddenly, the ship shuddered as a blast of energy hit the hull. The mechanic grabbed onto his seat to steady himself. "They're firing at us," Luma shouted. "Hold on." She maneuvered the ship sharply, dodging another blast. The mechanic's heart raced as the pursuers closed in. He could see their ships now, sleek, black, and menacing. "We need to buy more time," Luma said, her voice strained. "The device is almost ready, but if they disable the ship..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the mechanic understood. If the pursuers stopped them, everything they had fought for would be lost. He looked at Luma, his mind racing. There had to be a way to distract the pursuers, to give her the time she needed. And then it hit him. "I'll do it," he said. Luma turned to him, her eyes wide. "Do what?" "I'll distract them," the mechanic said. "I can take one of the escape pods and lead them away. It'll give you the time you need to activate the device." Luma shook her head. "No. It's too dangerous. They'll capture you, or worse." The mechanic reached out and took her hand. "It's the only way. You said it yourself, billions of lives are at stake. I can't let them win." Luma's eyes filled with tears. "But you'll..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but the mechanic knew what she was thinking. He might not survive this. But he also knew it was a risk he had to take. "I'll be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Just promise me you'll finish the mission." Luma hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." The mechanic gave her hand a final squeeze, then stood and made his way to the escape pod. As he climbed inside, he felt a strange sense of calm. He had spent his life fixing things, but now he was doing something much bigger. He was making a difference. The escape pod launched, shooting away from the ship. Almost immediately, the pursuers changed course, following the pod instead. The mechanic watched as Luma's ship grew smaller in the distance, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he'd ever see Luma again. But he knew one thing: he had done the right thing. As the pursuers closed in, the mechanic leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He thought of Luma, of her courage and determination. He thought of the stars, so vast and beautiful. And he thought of the lives he had helped save. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. The mechanic drifted in the escape pod, the stars outside the small window his only companions. He had no idea where he was or if the pursuers were still following him. The pod systems were running low on power, and he knew he didn't have much time left. He thought about Luma, hoping she had succeeded in sending the device to her people. He thought about Earth, about his small workshop and the life he had left behind. And he thought about the choices he had made, wondering if he had done enough. Just as the pod's lights began to flicker, a strange sound filled the air, a low hum, growing louder by the second. The mechanic sat up, his heart racing. Was it the pursuers? Had they found him? But then a familiar shape appeared outside the window. It was Luma's ship, sleek and glowing, coming to a stop beside the pod. The mechanic's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe it. The ship's docking mechanism connected to the pod, and a moment later, the hatch opened. Luma stood there, her violet eyes filled with relief and joy. "You came back," the mechanic said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I did," Luma replied, stepping forward and helping him out of the pod. "I made a promise, remember?" The mechanic felt a wave of emotions, relief, gratitude, and something deeper he couldn't quite name. He had been prepared to die, but now, standing here with Luma, he felt like he had been given a second chance. "Did it work?" he asked. "The device?" Luma nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "It worked. My people are safe, thanks to you." The mechanic felt a surge of pride. He had done it. He had helped save an entire planet. But before he could say anything, Luma took his hand and led him deeper into the ship. "There's something I want to show you," she said. They entered a large room filled with glowing panels and strange devices. In the center of the room was a holographic image of a planet, a beautiful, vibrant world with shimmering oceans and towering cities. "This is my home," Luma said, her voice filled with pride. "And thanks to you, it will thrive again." The mechanic stared at the image, awestruck. He had never seen anything so beautiful. But then Luma turned to him, her expression serious. "I want you to come with me," she said. "To my world. You have a place there, if you want it." The mechanic's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm just a mechanic." Luma shook her head. "You're more than that. You're a hero. And my people would be honored to have you." The mechanic felt a lump in his throat. He had spent his life feeling invisible, like he didn't belong. But now, Luma was offering him a chance to be part of something bigger, something extraordinary. I don't know what to say," he stammered. Luma smiled. "Say yes." The mechanic looked at her, then at the holographic image of her world. He thought about his life on Earth, about the small town and the workshop he had left behind. And then he thought about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll come with you." Luma's eyes lit up with joy. She took his hand and squeezed it gently. "You won't regret it." As the ship set course for her world, the mechanic felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. The mechanic stood at the window of Luma's ship, staring in awe as they approached her planet. From space, it looked like a jewel, shimmering oceans, lush green forests, and cities that sparkled like stars. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. "Welcome to my home," Luma said, standing beside him. Her voice was filled with pride and warmth. The mechanic couldn't find the words to respond. He was overwhelmed by the beauty of it all. But as the ship descended through the atmosphere, he began to notice something else: the scars of war. Cratered landscapes, ruined buildings, and vast areas of land that looked barren and lifeless. "It's not all perfect, is it?" he asked softly. Luma's expression grew somber. "No. The war took a heavy toll. But we're rebuilding. And now, thanks to you, we have hope." The mechanic nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had helped save this world, and now he was here to help heal it. When the ship landed, they were greeted by a crowd of Luma's people. They were tall and elegant, with skin in shades of blue and violet, and eyes that glowed with intelligence and kindness. They cheered as Luma stepped off the ship, and their cheers grew louder when they saw the mechanic. "They know what you did," Luma said, smiling at him. "You're a hero to them." The mechanic felt a mix of pride and embarrassment. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. But as he looked at the faces in the crowd, he saw gratitude and hope. It made him feel like he belonged. Over the next few days, Luma showed him around the planet. He saw the cities, where towering spires reached into the sky, and the countryside, where fields of glowing crops stretched as far as the eye could see. He met scientists, artists, and leaders, all working together to rebuild their world. But it wasn't all easy. The mechanic quickly realized that Luma's people faced many challenges. Resources were scarce, and the damage from the war was extensive. There was still so much work to be done. One day, Luma took him to a massive workshop filled with broken machines and damaged technology. "This is where you can help," she said. "Your skills are needed here." The mechanic looked around, his eyes lighting up. It was like his old workshop, but on a much larger scale. He could see the potential in every broken machine, every piece of discarded technology. "I'll do whatever I can," he said. And so, he got to work. He repaired machines, designed new tools, and even taught Luma's people some of the techniques he had learned on Earth. They were quick learners, and soon, the workshop was buzzing with activity. As the days turned into weeks, the mechanic began to feel at home. He made friends, learned about the planet's culture, and even started to pick up a few words of their language. But most importantly, he found a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. One evening, as the twin moons rose in the sky, Luma found him in the workshop. He was working on a new project, a device that could help purify the planet's water. "You've done so much already," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "But you don't have to work so hard. You should take some time to rest." The mechanic smiled. "I don't mind. I like keeping busy. And besides, there's still so much to do." Luma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed, you know. Since you first came here." The mechanic paused, considering her words. "I guess I have. I feel different. Like I've found my place." Luma reached out and took his hand. "You have. And we're grateful to have you here." The mechanic felt a warmth spread through him. He had come to this world as a stranger, but now, he was part of something bigger. He had a purpose, a home, and people who cared about him. As he looked out at the glowing landscape, he knew one thing for certain: his journey was far from over. The mechanic stood on a hill overlooking the city, the twin moons casting a soft glow over the landscape. It had been months since he first arrived on Luma's planet, and so much had changed. The scars of war were slowly healing, thanks to the hard work of Luma's people, and his own contributions. He thought about his journey, from the small workshop on Earth to this vibrant, alien world. He thought about the risks he had taken, the sacrifices he had made, and the friendships he had built. And he thought about Luma, who had shown him a new way of life. As he stood there, lost in thought, Luma approached him. She carried a small, glowing device in her hands, a gift from her people. "They made this for you," she said, handing it to him. "It's a symbol of gratitude. You've done so much for us." The mechanic took the device, feeling its warmth in his hands. It was beautiful, intricately designed, and glowing with a soft, steady light. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I didn't do it for recognition. I just wanted to help." Luma smiled. "I know. And that's what makes you special. You didn't ask for anything in return. You gave everything you had, even when it wasn't easy." The mechanic looked at her, his eyes shining. I didn't think I had much to offer. Back on Earth, I was just a mechanic. But here, I feel like I've found my purpose. Luma nodded. Sometimes, it takes leaving everything behind to discover who we really are. You came here as a stranger, but now, you're one of us. You've made a difference, not just for my people, but for yourself. The mechanic felt a lump in his throat. He had spent so much of his life feeling invisible, like he didn't matter. But now, he realized that everyone has the power to make a difference, no matter how small they feel. I've learned so much, he said. About courage, about kindness, about what it means to truly belong. I used to think I was just fixing machines, but now I see that I was fixing something much bigger, myself. Luma placed a hand on his shoulder. And that's the greatest lesson of all. Life isn't about where you start or what you have. It's about what you do with the time you're given. You've shown that even one person can change the world. The mechanic looked out at the city, at the people working together to rebuild their lives. He thought about the challenges they had faced and the hope that had carried them through. And he realized that he was part of that hope. I'm glad I came here, he said. I'm glad I met you. Luma smiled, her violet eyes glowing with warmth. And I'm glad you stayed. As they stood there together, watching the twin moons rise higher in the sky, the mechanic felt a deep sense of peace. He had found a new home, a new family, and a new purpose. And he knew that no matter where life took him next, he would carry the lessons he had learned with him. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. Because in the end, he had discovered the most important truth of all, that the greatest rewards in life come from helping others and being true to yourself.